You record. And minimize this. Whoops. I'm going to go view full screen. Okay. So next up, one of the parts of this deal is to create liquid assets. What Hamilton wanted to do was to create safe assets. I mean, it's an issue today, very much so, that, that there's a lot of talk today about why, U.S. interest rates are so low. And one is that there's just a shortage of safe assets in the world. There were definitely, you could argue that there were, what Hamilton sees and he advocates in this report is that there's a shortage of safe assets back in 1790, and he wants to create a market of safe assets. So what he wants to do is again, consolidate all of this debt, all of these different state debts, all of these different types of federal debts.
George.
Yes.
Sorry, could you please share your screen?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Was I not sharing?
I think it's recently, George. You were sharing earlier, the first time.
Okay, well, so was I sharing during those videos? Oops, hold on. Okay. Back to the meeting. Now am I sharing?
Yes.
Now I'm sharing. Okay, was I sharing during those videos? Or is anyone there? With me?
You're here. No, we didn't see any videos.
Oh, disaster.
We heard them, but...
Okay, well, let's get going. Okay. View. I was trying to show the lyrics on those songs. Okay, well, very good. Okay. So can you see them now? Are we good now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All righty. So we have creation of safe assets. So one is to consolidate all of these different types of bonds into 3 individual securities, just simply break it down. And remember that once these after 10 years, these deferred 6% stocks are going to turn into just regular 6% stocks, so we're going to go down to 2. So now we have this debt market. We have a national debt market. There's $70 million in debt now outstanding. Security markets start to appear in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And you quickly start to see weekly prices printed in newspapers. It's not too hard. You can go down to the basement of NYU, the library there, and take a look at some of these old newspapers, and you can see quotes for these three different types of securities. And Hamilton proposes, he goes back and forth on this. He gets accused of wanting to create a permanent debt. He says, oh, no, I don't want to do it. But then it really does. He then goes on and explains the virtues of having a debt that you don't retire, but to roll over. And he doesn't need to roll it over because there's no maturity date. And particularly in this report on public credit, he says, this is a great quote. I just think this is a great quote. He says, it's a well-known fact that in countries in which the national debt is properly funded, and that is that there's a discounted present value of future surpluses is such that, to keep the debt at face value. So when the national debt is publicly funded and an object of established confidence, it answers most of the purposes of money. Transfers of stock or public debt are there equivalent to payment in specie, or in other words, stock in the principal transaction of business passes current as specie. And that is, he wants these bonds to essentially play the role of money. That we're not going to have a currency, but not have a fiat currency. But these bonds can play the role of money and help facilitate trade and help grow the nation on that. He's going to do a few other things to create a liquid markets. One, he's going to put out a series of reports early on in his role as Secretary of Treasury. One, he's going to charter a monopoly bank in the United States. He's going to issue a central bank. It's going to be a fiscal agent for the federal government. It's going to, a place where the government can borrow and lend. It's going to be capitalized at $10 million. A fifth of that the federal government will own, and 4/5 will be owned privately. Some of it will be owned by foreign shareholders. It's going to be headquartered in Philadelphia, and the Bank of the United States, the building still stands. You know, you can go see it. It should be a museum, but it's owned by the Park Service, but you can't go into it. He's then also going to establish the Coinage Act of 1792, 2 years later, in which it's going to establish silver and gold dollars as a unit of money for the United States. So that is, you know, that's when the dollar actually becomes a US dollar and create a national currency. And he's going to argue that these deep and liquid capital markets are going to foster corporations. And he's going to try to attract both foreign and domestic investors as well. You'll see that this deal does generate a very sharp increase in security prices. So if you look, so let me just note here. So here you can see exactly when his report on public credit comes out, and you'll see that prior to that, securities are trading around 20 cents on the dollar, and then there's a sharp rise in the market value of these securities, and you see it that these speculators, that these securities go from trading about 20 cents on the dollar up to some of these securities trade, you know, at par, at dollar for dollar. That's a 500% increase, 500% rate of return. I mean, or fivefold increase, 400% rate of return. I mean, it's really quite dramatic. This sharp increase in just a couple of years in I mean, huge capital gains that are going to these securities, or going to these bondholders. Whoops, let me clear that. Here, if we take a look at a slightly longer time series, this is for these 6%, the deferred 6, and the 3% stock. One thing you'll note real quickly is the 3% stocks trades for half the price of a 6% stock, which makes sense once you just think about how you price a console. They should trade at half its value, but recall that these are the market prices of these securities, and so when the government is promising to pay, redeem interest, it's redeeming if the interest rate is 6%, and I've got a security that pays a console that pays 3%, that's going to trade at 50 cents on the dollar. And that's exactly what you see. Is interest rates right around during this period are about 6%. So a bond that promises to pay 6% trades roughly at face value. However, much of the debt did not promise to pay 6%. Interest promised to pay 3%, so it traded at half of face value. And the deferred 6% paid no interest for 10 years. And you see that they traded roughly at about the same price as the 3%. And then as it gets nearer to this date where they're going to start to pay 6% interest, the price rises and it eventually converges when they become a 6% stock. Let me also note that, so when these first get issued, they're trading at about 80 cents, the 6% stock's trading about 80% on the dollar. And then quickly, there is a big increase. Let me just note this, a big increase in the price of the debt. There's actually, these securities become quite popular. And there's actually a little bit of you could call a trading frenzy, something that you might refer to it as a bubble. Some might use that term, but these things, it becomes wildly popular to trade in these things. And this is sort of exactly what Jefferson is sort of worried about. This is sort of corrupting. Someone asked about whether these securities are moral or not, and about borrowing on interest, was it perceived as immoral? Partly this trading frenzy is seen as corrupting of American morals. Jefferson and Madison are going to rage against this. That's this bubble that occurs in the early 1990s, and then there's a quick collapse. That this is all essentially, the moneyed men manipulating these prices for their own advantage. And Hamilton is going to be accused of participating in this. It's going to be false. He doesn't actually profit individually, is himself personally off this stuff, but he's going to be accused of manipulating this sort of sharp rise and then this sharp fall in the price of these securities for his own advantage. But it's going to be part of this sort of moral argument that a student recommended. Again, all of these securities, you'll see they all start, again, you see the sharp rise in prices for many of these securities of final settlement certificates and the 6% stock. When they're trading one for one, they move together. And the 3% stock in these U.S. indents, again, also move close to one for one during this period. State debts also kind of, their state debts are treated as some sort of essentially average of these two securities, and likewise the prices reflect that. Now, the question is, did Hamilton pay back at par? And it's important. One thing to note is that he doesn't pay back completely at par. If you think about, if you take a look at, say, June 30th, 1791, just to give an example, the prices are nice round numbers, so it makes the calculations easy. In 1791, the price of a 6% stock traded at $90. The deferred 6% stocks traded at $50, and the 3% stocks traded at $50. So you can see the 3% stock trades about roughly half of what a 6% stock did. So if you came in and you had, say, you came in on June 30th, 1791, you came into the Treasury and you had $100 face value of an old Revolutionary War claim, what would you would get certificates worth what in value? So if you had a loan office certificate, you would get 2/3 of a 6% stock and 1/3 of a deferred 6% stock. So you get 2/3 of 90 plus 1/3 of 50. And that would leave you with $76.67, something that had a market value of $76.67. So it was a haircut of about 23% that these guys were given on this. They did not get when they brought in something that was worth $100, they were given securities that were worth something, in silver, of about $76. So they were given pretty sharp haircuts. For state debts, they were given a haircut of about 1/3. For an interest in arrear, you were given a haircut of about 50%. And again, if you continental dollar, you were given a haircut of about $99. Now, remember that the market price for a loan office certificate, just a few years earlier was about $20. So that, this is still an enormous gain. Enormous capital gain, but it's hardly, you wouldn't argue that it was necessarily face value for this. They were given haircuts. So they were not promised everything. They were not given everything they were promised, but they were given a lot more than they expected to get just a few years earlier, and still given large gains. If you take a look at the difference between the par value and the market value of the debt, we've talked about this. The par value is the face value of the debt, and then what the market value of the debt is what is price times quantity, or how much would it cost to buy back all of the debt at today's market prices. You can see that in 1788, the face value of the debt is about 50 million. And the market value of the debt is somewhere around 20 million. Now, the face value of the debt rises sharply with the assumption of the state debts. But this gap between the market value of the debt and the par value of the debt, this gap here between the market value and the par value, shrinks considerably as it raised the market value of the debt, with the refunding on that. And if we take a look at the ratio of the market value of the debt to the par value of the debt, you'll see that, early on, prior to the Act of 1790, the market value of the debt is about 40% of the share of the par value of the debt. You'll see this, again, is going to be quite, before the refunding goes on, people in anticipation of this refunding start to buy up. Some of these speculators start to buy up much of this of the existing Revolutionary War debt. The speculators do it in anticipation of repayment. This is going to generate this view that again that this these evil speculators are out buying up debt in anticipation of that they know something, that it's insiders who know something about what's going to happen to these securities, buy them up, and you can see prices rise in anticipation of this act. That again is going to infuriate critics such as Jefferson and Madison. Let me just clear all drawings. If we take a look at longer, it's also going to be one thing that's sort of interesting on this graph is you'll see that the U.S. debt trades at a discount for many years, even after this refunding. It is not that the debt trades at par, and the debt's actually not going to trade at par until well after the War of 1812. It's not until this period here, after the War of 1812, in which debt is going to trade at face value. The U.S. debt, for the first really almost 30 years of its existence, trades at a discount, and at a fairly significant discount. And there's some irony here. Is you'll notice that it's after James Madison becomes president. It's really after James Madison is president that the debt trades at par, truly at par. We often think of, it's Hamilton that's given credit as redeeming the debt at par. And Jefferson and Madison is criticized, as trying to talk down the value of the debt. As a congressman, he's very much opposed to bringing up the debt, bringing up the market value of the debt equal to the par value debt when he's a congressman. However, when he's a president, that's when it's right after he leaves the presidency, but he basically has done the setup for it. He's in some ways we're going to see he's going to be more Hamiltonian than Hamilton himself, and the debt holders are going to be repaid completely in full, and the market value will equal the par value. That debt will trade at face value after the Madison administration. Now, another criticism that they had of this refunding program, Thomas Jefferson was very worried about, was that and this is his misspelling, not ours. The natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and the government to gain ground. That by getting a hold of this tax revenue, this is going to cause an increase in the size of government spending. That Jefferson says, give me the tariff revenue, and I'll use this tariff revenue to make the coupon payments. And Jefferson is worried that you're going to get this revenue and you're going to turn around and spend it. And lo and behold, it is what happens. In this graph, these two sets of graph, I'm plotting government revenue in a per capita basis. I don't really have GDP, so we have to do it per capita. And you'll see that, and there's very different characters. They're different colors because they're different types of government revenue, and the different types, sort of the left-hand graph is before the Constitution, and the second graph is after the Constitution. They have very different sources of revenue before and after. So there's the different colors denote the different types of revenue. But you'll see that revenue on a per capita basis goes up quite dramatically after the signing of the U.S. Constitution. The federal government gets the tariff revenue, and you see that tariff revenue, which is in blue on the right-hand side of the graph, on the right-hand panel, tariff revenue is in blue. It rises from about $1 per person to about $2 per person. It doubles over the course of 15 years, from 1791 to 1804. Okay, so revenues increased dramatically. They were only like 25 cents per person prior to the Constitution. They go up to $1 per person after the Constitution, rise to $2. And you can see what happens to government spending as well. So once they funded the war, in the left-hand panel is government spending prior to the U.S. Constitution. And on the right-hand panel is government spending per capita after the Constitution. Both are in per capita basis. And you can see that after the signing of the Constitution, the government spending rises. It rises dramatically, and let me note that the green on the right-hand panel is the interest payments on the debt. That's what Hamilton says, I'm going to just make the interest payments on the debt. But you'll see that spending on other things, which is the blue, and spending on the military, which is in brown, also goes up dramatically. These spikes, I should point out, these spikes in 1792. Let me just note this. This is the funding, or the starting up of the Bank of the United States. The U.S. government kicked in $2 million into that. And then this, which we'll talk about in a second, in a little bit, is the Louisiana Purchase from France. So this is the purchase of about a third of the North American continent, or of the United States share of the American continent in 1803 from France. If we look at deficits, it's kind of interesting in that they, they're basically running a balanced budget prior to the signing of the Constitution. On the left-hand panel, they kind of have to, because they can't borrow money. On the right-hand side, they do run modest surpluses. These are primary surpluses. Afterwards, primary surpluses here on the right-hand side. And so one question is sort of what's the legacy of 1790? This is going to be Hamilton is revered in U.S. sort of financial circles, and people will often wrap themselves in the cloak of Hamilton, and we'll see that throughout the next several lectures, is that people will argue that they are honoring the legacy of Alexander Hamilton by proposing one thing or another. And so one question is sort of, did Alexander Hamilton lower the interest rate through discrimination and repudiation? Did he? Well, yeah, he did in some sense discriminate and repudiate some of the debt. He did not honor all of the debt not everybody got promised everything that they didn't receive everything that they were promised. However, did he honor the sort of implicit and explicit promises of the past? Well, kind of yes. He does come back, and he doesn't default on the debt. He doesn't default completely, but he doesn't give them everything that they were promised. Does he strengthen the federal government relative to the states, but in the process sow the seeds of a crisis 50 years later? Well, kind of yeah, he does. He do that. And then does he help create deep and liquid financial markets, but also create a legacy of perpetual debt, thus sort of strengthening the hand of the moneyed men over federal policy? And that, he creates deep and liquid financial markets, and he ties the moneyed men, or Wall Street, it's sort of to the government, and that's going to be both a blessing and a curse, as we'll see. Finally, on the last slide, it's sort of, he plays a very interesting political game. He's able to create, what he wants to do is he wants to create two different reputations. One is a reputation that the federal government repays its bondholders. But he's also going to create a reputation in that it doesn't issue fiat currency. So it's extremely honorable when it comes to issuing interest-bearing debt. The U.S. government repays, but when it comes to issuing fiat currency, you better not trust us, you better not accept it. And because nobody will accept it, we'll never be able to issue it. And so this ability to kind of maintain different reputations with different parties is quite a political feat on how he can do that. He is going to create this sort of free rider problem. And this question about whether the bailouts of the 1790 creates a view that the government stands behind the state debts. Again, somebody asked about that in their responses, and we'll talk about that we'll talk about that in a couple of lectures. And then there's also some issues for Europe now. I mean, there's some similarities and some differences. I mean, the US did a fiscal union first, and then it's going to be a monetary union second, whereas Europe has a monetary union, but no fiscal union. But you could argue that we were in a currency union with Spain from the beginning. But there's some interesting discussion thinking about whether, you know, this is when thinking about Europe today, it's useful to think about the U.S. in the 1780s, and we had like a textbook fiscal crisis, and Alexander Hamilton came up with a textbook response to how to resolve a fiscal crisis. The basic idea was you get a hold of some new tax revenue in order to repay the debt. You then promise to repay the debt, but the bondholders don't get everything. Taxpayers take a hit with higher taxes, but the bondholders also take a hit in that they're not given everything that they were promised. And again, you also generally treat the foreigners better than the domestics on that. It's a textbook or case study on how to get out of a fiscal crisis. Let me just ask if there's any questions before I go on. Any questions? Or can you guys hear me? Hold on, there we go. Got a chat here. Not here. Hearing no questions? Okay, we'll keep going. Let me talk a little bit about the early republic. And just kind of debating whether this is a topic we want to cover or not, but I think we do. And I think what it does, it lays out sort of two visions of debt and spending. And these are two traditions that carry with us through to this day. I think it's there's essentially two different coalitions. There's the Federalists, who are, you want to think about it, people like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and then you have the Republicans, which are people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Albert Gallatin, a guy we're going to talk about. And there are kind of two periods here that we will talk about. Those are the Federalist period, which is the administrations of Washington and Adams from 1790 to 1801, and then from 1801 to 1812, which are the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. And they're in this book by Dewey, and I realized Dewey's on our syllabus, and I cited it. I know I gave you guys a lot of reading in just a couple of days, so I kind of apologize for that. But let me just show you. Whoops. I was going to show you. Whoops, I don't have it. But the Dewey, if you just go Dewey, the Financial History of the United States. There we go. It's online. Bang, there it is. There's the book. It's also on Google Books as well, so you can get it. But let's go back. And there are these two periods, and there are these great debates about sort of how to think about the United States and how to think about how the fiscal policy should be set up in the U.S. One way I like to think about it is I like to think about the U.S. Treasury Building. So if you go down to Washington D.C., the U.S. Treasury is the one department that's on the White House grounds. It's right next to the White House, which just goes to show you some of the stature of the U.S. Treasury relative, how important it is relative, to all other departments. It literally sits. It's the one department that sits on White House grounds. And in the building, if you've got a $10 bill, whip out a $10 bill, and take a look at the back of a $10 bill. That's a picture of the Treasury Building on there, and you'll see that there's a statue out front. It's actually a statue of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's the one person who's on a bill twice. He's both on the front and on the back. And so on one side of the Capitol is a picture of a statue of Alexander Hamilton, And on the other side of the Treasury Building, on the other side, there's no front and there's no back, but it's either one side or the other, is a statue of Albert Gallatin. He's the 4th Secretary of the Treasury. He's actually the longest. He actually served the longest of anyone as Secretary of the Treasury. And they have two very different visions about the role of the federal government, the role of tax policy, and the role of debt in society. And much of sort of the U.S. sort of fiscal tradition can be thought about this sort of tension between sort of Hamilton's ideals and Gallatin's ideas. You may recognize the name Gallatin. We've been talking about Alexander Hamilton as our hero, but you guys at NYU, Gallatin should be your hero since he founded NYU. He's the founder of NYU, one of the founders of NYU. But we're going to say mostly nice things about Albert Gallatin. We are a fan of both of them. Now, both of them, actually, I should also point out that both of these guys are foreign born. I think it's interesting that, and it's worth noting that neither of these people, neither Gallatin nor Hamilton, were born in the United States. Neither of them are part of sort of the landed gentry. And so they're unlike the other sort of people who helped set up the United States and set up our government, in that they weren't big landowners, they weren't slaveholders. They were able to think, they understood how commerce worked. They understand how business worked. They understand, exchanging the role of money and debt, and how financial markets and banks worked, and the important role that they played in the economy. Unlike, the big landowners like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, who were there. So they're different, and I think that's part of why they were as powerful or as influential as they were, and saw things the way they saw them. But they're both going to be blasted away, probably, criticized very, for being foreign, quite unfairly on this. Now they're going to debate about lots of things. So one is the role of tariffs and the role of trade policy. You can't think of a more timely topic than trade policy these days. And one is are tariffs going to be the role of revenue? Or are they going to be used for policy, for carrying out policy? Are they going to be, are they going to engage in something that looks like industrial policy, where we pick winners and losers? And can tariffs be used to try to manipulate foreign policy, to try to carry out sort of foreign policy objectives? There's going to be lots of debates on expenditures. How big should the military be? Should there be a standing army or navy? What's the role of internal improvements? Back in the day, they were called internal improvements. Nowadays, they'd be called infrastructure. Who's in charge of building roads and bridges and tunnels and things like that? What's the role of servicing debt? Making coupon payments. We'll talk about what a sinking fund is. I know someone asked about that, and we'll talk about that. And then what's the role of public debt? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? I mean, if you listen in today's discussion, there's a lot of discussion about how public debt is again, it's immoral, and it's a burden that we're passing on to the next generation, and that it's there's plenty of quotes, largely by if you take a look at the Republicans who were running for the Republican candidates other than Trump, who were running for the Republican nomination, you Google what their views were on the national debt, and they're going to argue that it's immoral, it's evil, and we should be paying down the debt. Others will argue that U.S. debt's an extremely useful object. It's a safe asset, and we need more of it, not less of it, in order to carry out transactions. And then also the role of central banking in a country. There's going to be a big debate on that. So we've already talked a little bit about Hamilton's view. Wants a strong federal government, and part of that comes out of his experience of fighting a war as part of an underfunded military. He also wants government creditors to support a federal government, big strong government. He wants lots of liquid assets and a strong banking system, and he wants a diversified economy. Hamilton is a protectionist. It's kind of interesting. He wants to use tariffs to provide protection to nurse U.S. manufacturing. He thinks we're a young country, and much like what you hear out of developing nations these days, that they need protection from the rest in order to develop protection from the rest of the world, from the global marketplace, in order to develop a manufacturing base, and he wants to use tariffs to protect U.S. industry. In terms of foreign policy, he's going to see very much wants strong ties to Europe, and in particular Britain, a country that was just our enemy and who we just gained our independence to. He's going to say, yeah, but they're also who we belong to sort of culturally, and it's who our biggest trading partner is. We need to be good friends with Britain, and or at least we need to have good relationships with Britain. Jefferson, on the other hand, is going to look at the British and the European system and be outraged. In some sense, let me show you this way. One way to think about it is, so let me show you. You remember the slide that Tom showed when he was talking about the French Revolution? This was like in the second lecture. And you'll see that this is government spending. This is British government spending. And you take a look at these spikes in government spending as it fights wars, and you look at the growth of revenue, and you look at the increase in debt, and you see how they're able to sort of keep revenue smooth while spending spikes, and they're able to use debt to do it. And then the debt to GDP ratio, well, I'll just stop here. I'll do this. The debt to GDP ratio in Britain grows dramatically on this. This is kind of a Rorschach test for Hamilton and Jefferson. So Hamilton looks at this and says, look at this tax smoothing. Look at this, at the way Britain is able to finance large government spending. Revenues are increasing, debt's increasing, but it's able to fight these wars effectively, and become a superpower. This is a good model for the US. Jefferson looks at this and says, oh my goodness, look at what Britain is able to do by having access to these debt markets. By having access to the debt markets, it's able to go and create all these wars, create an empire, create this big, huge, powerful government that is trampling on other people's freedoms. This is a terrible thing to do. We can't let a government ever have that kind of power, and particularly one in the United States cannot have that power to borrow. If it has that power to borrow, has that power of the purse, it will become big and powerful itself, and that's a terrible thing. Hamilton looks at that and says, that's a great thing. And so in terms of, thinking about this, was borrowing on interest perceived as immoral, this question that was asked by a student, Jefferson is going to say yes, that by borrowing and access to these credit markets, you are going to create the flaws of the British and the European system. It's going to create a monarchy. It creates a luxury. It's going to create a class system. It's going to create financial corruption. And he's going to cite this run up in the price of the bonds in 1991 and 92 is that. If you can finance wars, you're going to fight wars. That if government realizes that it can borrow to finance a war, then it's going to get into military adventures. And then these high levels of debt are going to end up leading to high tax burdens. I mean, the irony of this, just remember this, there's going to be a tremendous amount of irony in all of this, given what Jefferson and Madison are going to do once they get into power. So, but keep in mind, but they're going to rail against Hamilton against this idea. And so Jefferson, says, we're going to be, and it comes out in that first rap of the cabinet battle where he says, we want to remain agricultural, and that let the factories remain in Europe, and we'll remain an agricultural society. Europe manufacturing will occur in Europe. We will export agricultural goods and import manufacturing goods from Europe. Now, of course, that's easy to say. Jefferson, over the course of his lifetime, owned over 600 slaves, which again also gets pointed out in that first rap in the thing. So there's talk about a rigid class system. That one person alone owns 600 other human beings. It's quite something. So Jefferson's going to have a very narrow interpretation of the Constitution and a very limited role for the federal government. Jefferson's going to be the free trader, and Hamilton's going to be the protectionist. He wants to export agricultural goods and import manufacturing goods, and he wants to use tariffs to reshape our relationship with Europe. He's very concerned about how we're perceived, and he wants to be perceived as an equal to the superpower, particularly, Britain. And he's going to say, look, our future is not Europe. Europe is the old country. It is not where we want to be. Where we want to be, we need to look to the West. We've got this brand new country. We've got this country. We've just got this whole new continent. We need to think West, not East. And we should think our focus, we should basically let Europe go be Europe. And there's a reason we left Europe. We're on this new continent. Let's think about going West, not East on there. Okay, so where do we stand? Okay, right now, in terms of budgets, customs revenue makes up the bulk of the revenue. Someone had asked about buying land out, buying land out west. I had one student responded, the fact that after and during 1789, families were buying land with easy credit. We're going to talk about some of these land purchases. They were attempting to sell land out in the West in order to make money. And Jefferson, in that report on public credit, Hamilton spends a lot of time talking about selling land out west, some of this Western land. It actually generates very little revenue. We'll talk more about this in a little later. But basically, people are settling out west. People are moving out west and settling out west faster than the federal government can measure it, record it, and then sell it off. People are just moving there. By the time the federal government shows up to try to sell it, somebody's already on it. Most expenditures are going to be spent on the military and interest payments, and then you're going to see big spikes for the Bank of the United States and Louisiana Purchase. So if we look at revenues, this is revenues as a percent of GDP, and you'll see that the government's about 2% of GDP in terms of revenues. And the blue, which is customs revenue, is the bulk of government revenue. It's the big mother lode of government revenue. We'll talk about this big drop in 1809 in a little bit, about why that drop came from. That drop has to be one of the stupidest policies ever implemented in the U.S. or ever. I mean, a lot of stupid policies, but this is a doozy. Once you think it through, it's going to sound like the most. You'll understand where that came from. It's a really stupid policy. But you'll see customs revenue is the big one. Internal revenue, it's going to grow some. So this is taxing, domestic people, but it's always going to be quite small. And then you'll notice it comes to an abrupt halt in 1804, which we'll talk about in a sec. Expenditures, you'll see these two spikes, which is the founding of the Bank of the United States and the Louisiana Purchase. Bank of the United States in 1792, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And then it's largely interest payments on the debt. Financing a war, financing an army and a navy on that, on there. And then you'll notice the sharp decline after 1800. What's interesting is sort of after this grand bargain, expenditures jump, and the federal government, after 10 years is actually 10 times larger than it was. By 1795, about 40% of the expenditures are going to the Army and Navy, and another 40% are going to interest payments. The economy is growing very rapidly during this period. So G over Y, if we think about the ratio of government spending to output, it's steady, or if you think about government spending for population, it's about steady. But what's interesting is both atoms, they have all this new revenue, they're gaining all this revenue, and these first two presidents, they still have to keep borrowing. They're spending more than they get a hold of this tax revenue, and just as Jefferson had feared, they start spending goes up, and it goes up even faster than revenue. If you look at it, you see the dramatic rise in spending. Initially spending on the Army and the Navy is $600,000. By 1800, they're spending $6 million on the Navy. Interest payments rise, and other things remain stable. But you'll see, sharp increase in military spending, sharp increase in interest on the debt goes way up as well, as they borrow more, and as borrowing goes up, and as the spending goes up as well. you know. We've seen these graphs. These are the graphs we've talked about there. What's interesting is, again, so federal government gets control of the customs revenue, but almost immediately it's clear that, I mean, it's sort of interesting. Hamilton gets the customs revenue, gets this big mother load of revenue, and then he immediately says, we need even more revenue. We need more to cover the military and to cover interest expenditures. And so he proposes a set of tax on luxuries and indulgences. And if you read that last half of the last third of that report on public credit, you know, he starts talking about all the different sources of tax revenue. It gets a little long in the tooth. And there is just huge opposition to this. There is simply, you know, why did we fight this revolution? We fought this revolution to get free of taxes. And what's Hamilton want to do? He wants to turn around and just lay more taxes on people. And in particular, one of the first things he's going to put a tax on is whiskey. And there also got mentioned about, remember in that rap, they said, you know, think about, we got frisky when you wanted to tax our whiskey. Let me show you, let me just talk a little bit about that. So one is this sort of idea about taxing whiskey. So the idea was, from Hamilton's point of view, whiskey is an indulgence. It's like a sin tax, you know, taxing, you know, nowadays we tax cigarettes, we tax alcohol, we think of it as being a sin tax. But if you think about the way the United States was back then, so here's a map of North America, and largely settlements are, you know, people are settling, you know, largely along the coastline here. But what's going on is you know, during this period, people are starting to settle. They're starting to cross this, there's this mountain range here. There's this range of mountains here. You know, the Appalachian Mountains here. And people are starting to cross over and settle, you know, in what's now Ohio, western Pennsylvania. They're crossing over into Kentucky, and starting to settle over into these areas. Now, if they're growing crops in these areas, so they're growing things like wheat and corn and various agricultural goods, if they want to get them to market, what they have to do is they have to bring them back over these mountain ranges. There's no roads and there's no rivers that are navigable to get them back over. And so what they're going to want to do is convert these grains into alcohol, which are going to be much higher value, and bring them back over these mountains for sale. So they're going to look at this. So the folks over here in the western part of the United States, and the western part of the United States is this region here, this is the West back then, are going to sit there and say, look it, you're going to tax whiskey. You're basically putting a tax on us, on our goods that we can then sort of transfer back over these mountains and sell back over to you guys. Where is this revenue going to go to? This revenue is going to go to pay interest payments on the debt. That's all just going to a bunch of rich folks in, you know, New York and Philadelphia. This is exactly what we don't want. We're paying taxes on us, you know, everyday poor folks, in order to just transfer money to those rich bondholders. And they're just, you know, they feel the burn. You know, this is a, you know, you can imagine, you know, the Bernie Sanders of the day and saying, you know, this is completely unfair. That why should we get taxed to cover interest payments on what we do? You call it an indulgence. We call it a necessity. It's what we have to do to get our goods to market. On that. And so by 1794, there's a good old tax revolt in western Pennsylvania. And there's a refusal there in western Pennsylvania. They refused, there's a rebellion. Let me just, here in western Pennsylvania, in this area here, there's a rebellion and they refuse to pay their taxes. Hamilton and Washington's the president, Hamilton's the Secretary of the Treasury. They see this as a direct, you know, challenge to a strong federal government. And they go and raise an army, and they take an army, and they go out and send troops. And Hamilton even is involved in the military planning and helps lead the troops to suppress this rebellion. And they show up, and they crush it. This rebellion is crushed, and taxes will be paid. Gallatin, at the time, he is settled in Western Pennsylvania. He sees this and he is outraged. He's immigrated from Switzerland to Western Pennsylvania, watches what's going on, and is completely outraged that this tax revolt has been crushed like this. So Hamilton crushes a tax revolt. He then imposes a carriage tax, and a few years later imposes a stamp tax on documents. If you just remember, go back to thinking about, about why we fought why we rebelled and fought for our freedom against the British. Why? Because of taxation without representation. What were the taxes that we were so outraged about? Well, we were outraged about a tax on tea. Now it's a tax on whiskey. We were outraged about taxes on property like carriage taxes, and particularly we were outraged about stamp taxes. Fast forward 20 years later, 25 years later, and Hamilton is back imposing all of these exact same taxes on these new, on the new citizens of the United States. He's out sending out troops to repress a tax rebellion and to enforce tax payments. It's everything. It's in the eyes of the Republicans, this is everything we fought the revolution for. Hamilton is just reinstating it back again. What do we have? We have a big debt and we have high taxes. Exactly what we had in Europe. This is just, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. It's the exact same thing. And this is, just infuriates the Republicans. The Republicans there. I mean, if you look, revenues go up dramatically. Again, customs revenue doubles, and indirect taxes also rise dramatically. Internal revenue and direct taxes. These are things like whiskey taxes and things go up dramatically. But still, the bulk of the revenue is customs revenue. But about 15% of the revenue is coming from things like the whiskey tax, carriage tax, things like that. Whoops, boy, time flies. And then let me just point out one more thing. So even during this time, just look what happens to debt. We get this stuff, we get these new taxes, we're supposed to pay off the debt. The debt doesn't get paid off. The debt actually grows. The debt actually grows by almost $10 million over the next 10 years. So over the course, when Hamilton's in power, what happens? The debt doesn't get paid off, taxes rise, spending rises. Now, GDP increases, so the debt to GDP ratio grows, and debt to GDP ratio actually falls. But government gets bigger, debt goes up, and spending goes up, and the government just gets larger. The Republicans are going to be outraged on this. They're going to take over power, and we're going to see a whole new regime. And we'll talk about that either in 1 week or in 2. But thanks so much. If there's not any more questions, I'll let you go. Are there any questions? Well then.
No questions here.
Okay. Bye for now. Have a great evening.